Hi everyone, welcome back to Pages of the Globe. Today I'm going to be reading to you the short story Everyday Use by Alice Walker. Before we start, I'm going to give you a quick overview about the author and then we'll get right into it. So, Alice Walker was born on February 9th, 1944, and she is an American novelist, short story writer, poet, and social activist. In 1982, she became the first African American woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, which she was awarded for on her novel, The Color Purple. Over the span of her career, Walker has published 17 novels and short story collections, 12 nonfiction works, and collections of essays and poetry. Alice Walker is an incredibly famous and very inspirational writer. She has been known to be a feminist and a vocal advocate for human rights and has earned critical and popular acclaim as a major American novelist and intellectual. The Color Purple, her Pulitzer-winning award third novel, was adapted into a popular film by Steven Spielberg, and many of you have maybe even watched it. Her numerous poetry collections include Hard Times Require Furious Dancing, Taking the Arrow Out of the Heart, and Her Blue Body, Everything We Know, Earthling Poems. Upon the release of The Color Purple, critics sensed that Walker had created something special. The Color Purple could be the kind of popular literary event that transforms into an intense reputation into a national one, according to Gloria Steinman of Miss Walker. One thing you will often note about Walker's writings is that it often reflects her roots in Georgia, where Black vernacular was prominent and the stamp of slavery and oppression were still present. When she was 8, Walker was accidentally shot in the eye by a brother playing with his BB gun. Her parents, who were too poor to afford a car, could not take her to a doctor for several days. By that time, her wound was so bad that she had lost the use of her right eye. This handicap influenced her writer's voice, and she withdrew from others and became a meticulous observer of human relationships and interaction. Walker is deeply invested in revealing the experiences of Black women, and one thing I have noticed myself is that she often writes the best of social and personal drama in the lives of familiar people who struggle for survival of self in hostile environments. She has expressed a special concern while exploring the oppressions and insanities, the loyalties, and the triumph of Black women. Before we start the story, I want to explain to you guys, if you guys have been noticing a little bit of a change in my stories, for the past few years I've been sending out videos. I often spoke about the authors and the stories impromptu and just whatever came into my mind, but I'm trying to get a little bit more of an in-depth review. And so I've been writing everything down, and in case you guys ever want anything written down or the transcript, please comment down below and I could always send it to you, because literally everything I say I've already written down in a docs. So I could always just copy paste that in and send it right over to you. And so please just let me know if you need that. Anyway, without further ado, let's get on with the story. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you'd like to read next. Everyday Use by Alice Walker. I will wait for her in the yard that Maggie and I made so clean and wavy yesterday afternoon. A yard like this is more comfortable than most people know. It's not just a yard, it's like an extended living room. When the hard clay is swept clean as a floor and the fine sand around the edges lined with tiny irregular grooves, anyone can come and sit and look up into the elm tree and wait for the breezes that never come inside the house. Maggie will be nervous until after her sister goes. She will stand hopelessly in the corners, homely and ashamed of the burn scars down her arms and legs, eyeing her sister with a mixture of envy and awe. She thinks her sister has held life always in the palm of one hand. That no is a word the world never learned to say to her. You've no doubt seen those TV shows where the child who has made it is confronted as a surprise by her own mother and father, tottering weakly from backstage. A pleasant surprise, of course. What would they do if a parent and child came on the show only to curse out and insult each other? On TV, mother and child embrace and smile into each other's faces. Sometimes the mother and father weep. The child wraps them in her arms and leans across the table to tell how she would not have made it without their help. I have seen these programs. Sometimes I dream a dream in which Dee and I are suddenly brought together on a TV program of this sort. Out of a dark and soft-seated limousine, I am ushered into a bright room filled with many people. Then I meet a smiling, gray, sporty man like Johnny Carson who shakes my hand and tells me what a fine girl I have. Then on the stage, and Dee is embracing me with tears in her eyes. She pins on my dress a large orchid, even though she has told me once that she thinks orchids are tacky flowers. In real life, I am a large, big-boned woman with rough, man-working hands. In the winter, I wear flannel nightgowns to bed and overalls during the day. I can kill and clean a hog as mercilessly as a man. My fat keeps me hot in zero weather. I can work outside all day breaking ice to get water for washing. I can eat pork liver cooked over the open fire minutes after it comes steaming from the hog. One winter, I knocked a bull calf straight in the brain between the eyes with a sledgehammer and had the meat hung up to chill before nightfall. But of course, all this does not show on television. I am the way my daughter would want me to be. 100 pounds lighter, my skin like uncooked barley pancake. My hair glistens in the hot, bright lights. Johnny Carson has much to do to keep up with my quick and witty tongue. But that is a mistake. I know even before I wake up. Whoever knew a Johnson with a quick tongue? Who can even imagine me looking a strange white man in the eye? It seems to me I have talked to them, always with one foot raised in flight, with my head fumed in whichever way is farthest from them. Dee, though, she would always look anyone in the eye. Hesitation was no part of her nature. "How do I look, Mama?" Maggie says, showing just enough of her thin body enveloped in pink skirt and red blouse for me to know that she's there, almost hidden by the door. "Come out into the yard," I say. Have you ever seen a lame animal, perhaps a dog, run over by some careless person rich enough to own a car, sidle up to someone who is ignorant enough to be kind to him? That is the way my Maggie walks. She has been like this, chin on chest, eyes on ground, feet in shuffle, ever since the fire that burned the other house to the ground. Dee is lighter than Maggie, with nicer hair and a fuller figure. She is a woman now, though. Sometimes I forget. How long was it that the other house burned? 10, 12 years? Sometimes I can still hear the flames and feel Maggie's arms sticking to me. Her hair is smoking and her dress falling off in little black papery flakes. Her eyes seem stretched open, blazed open by the flames reflected in them. And Dee, I see her standing off under the sweet gum tree she used to dig gum out of. A look of concentration on her face as she watches the last dingy gray board of the house fall into the red-hot brick chimney. "Why don't you dance around the ashes?" I'd wanted to ask her. She had hated that house that much. I used to think she hated Maggie, too, but that was before we raised money, the church and me, to send her to Augusta to school. She used to read to us without pity, forcing words, lies, other folks' habits, whole lives upon us two, sitting trapped and ignorant under her voice. She washed us in a river of make-believe, burned us with a lot of knowledge we didn't necessarily need to know, pressed us to her with the serious way she read to shove us away like dimwits at just the moment we seemed to understand. Dee wanted nice things, a yellow-orange Dee, just to wear to her graduation from high school, black pumps to match a green suit she'd made from an old suit somebody gave me. She was determined to stare down any disaster in her efforts. Her eyelids would not flicker for minutes at a time. Often I fought off the temptation to shake her. At 16, she had a style of her own and knew what style was. I never had an education myself. After second grade, the school was closed down. Don't ask me why. In 1927, colored asked fewer questions than they do now. Sometimes Maggie reads to me. She stumbles along good-naturedly, but can't see well. She knows she's not bright. Like good looks and money, quickness passes her by. She will marry John Thomas, who has mossy teeth and an earnest face. And then I'll be free to sit here and I guess just sing church songs to myself. Although I was never a good singer, never could carry a tune. I was always better at a man's job. I used to love to milk till I was hooked in the side in 49. Cows are soothing and slow and don't bother you unless you try to milk them the wrong way. I have deliberately turned my back on the house. It is 3 rooms, just like the one that burned, except the roof is tin. They don't make shingle roofs anymore. There are no real windows, just some holes cut up in the sides, like portholes in a ship, but not round, not square, with raw hide holding the shutters up on the outside. This house is in a pasture, too, like the other one. No doubt when Dee sees it, she will want to tear it down. She wrote to me once that no matter where we choose to live, she will manage to come see us, but she will never bring her friends. Maggie and I thought about this, and Maggie asked me, "Mama, when did Dee ever have any friends?" She had a few. Furtive boys in pink shirts hanging about on wash day after school. Nervous girls who never laughed. Impressed with her, they worshipped the well-turned phrase, cute-shaped, scalding humor that erupted like bubbles in lye. She read to them. When she was courting Jimmy T, she didn't have much time to pay to us, but turned all her fault-finding power on him. He flew to marry, a cheap city girl from a family of ignorant, flashy people. She hardly had time to recompose herself. When she comes, I will meet, but there they are. Maggie attempts to make a dash for the house in her shuffling way, but I stay her with my hand. "Come back here," I say, and she stops and tries to dig a well in the sand with her shoe. It's hard to see them clearly through the strong sun, but even the first glimpse of leg out of the car tells me it's Dee. Her feet were always neat looking, as if God himself had shaped them with a certain style. From the other side of the car comes a short, stocky man. Hair is all over his head, a foot long, hanging from his chin like a kinky mule tail. I hear Maggie suck in her breath. Is what it sounds like when you see the wriggling end of a snake just in front of your foot on the road. Dee next, a dress down to the ground in this hot weather. A dress so loud it hurts my eyes. There are yellows and oranges enough to throw the back of the light, the sun. I feel my face warming from the heat waves it throws. Earrings gold too and hanging down to her shoulders. Bracelets dangling and making noises as she moves her arm up to shake the folds of the dresses out of her armpits. Then the dress is loose and flows, and as she walks closer, I like it. I hear Maggie go, again. It's her sister's hair. It stands straight up like the wool on a sheep. It's as black as night, and around the edges are two long pigtails that rope about like small lizards disappearing behind her ears. "Wazoo cochino," she says, coming on in that gliding way the dress makes her move. The short, stocky fellow with the hair to his navel is all grinning as he follows up with, "As-malaikum, my mother and sister." He moves to hug Maggie, but she falls back, right up against the back of the chair. I feel her trembling, and when I look up, I see the perspiration falling off her chin. "Don't get up," says Dee. "Since I am stout, it takes something of a push. You can see me trying to move a second or two before I make it." She turns, showing white heels through her sandals, and goes back to the car. Out she peeks next with a Polaroid. She stoops down quickly, snaps off pictures of the house, of me sitting there in front of the house, with Maggie cowering behind me. She never takes a shot without making sure the house is included. When a cow comes nibbling around the edge of the yard, she snaps it, and me, Maggie, and the house. Then she puts the Polaroid in the back seat of the car and comes up, kisses me on the forehead. Meanwhile, As-malaikum is going through the motions with Maggie's hand. Maggie's hand is as limp as fish and probably as cold, despite the sweat, and she keeps trying to pull it back. It looks like As-malaikum wants to shake hands or do something fancy. Or maybe he doesn't know how people shake hands. Anyway, soon he gives up on Maggie. "Well," I say, "Dee?" "No, Mama," she says, "not Dee. Wangaro Liwanka Kimanjo." "What happened to Dee?" I wanted to know. "She's dead," Wangaro said. "I couldn't bear it any longer, being named after the people who oppressed me." "You know as well as me you were named after your Aunt Dee. Dee was my sister. She was named Dee. We called her Big Dee after Dee was born." "But who was she named after?" asked Mangaroo. "I guess after Grandma Dee." "And who was she named after?" asked Wangaroo. "Her mother," I said, and saw Wangaroo was getting tired. "That's about as far back as I can trace it," I said. Though in fact, I could probably have carried it back beyond the Civil War through the branches. "Well," said As-malaikum, "there you are." I heard Maggie say. "There I was not," I said, "before DC cropped up in our family. So why should I try to trace it back that far?" He just stood there grinning. looking down on me as if someone was inspecting a Model A car. Every once in a while, he and Wangaroo sent eye signals over my head. "How do you pronounce this name?" I asked. "You don't have to call me by it if you don't want to," said Wangaroo. "Why shouldn't I asked. "If that's what you want us to call you, we'll call you." "I know it might sound awkward at first," said Wangaroo. "I'll get used to it," I said. "Ream it out again." As soon as we had gotten the name out of the way, Asmalikam had a name twice as long and 3 times as harder. After I tripped over it 2 or 3 times, he told me to just call him Hakim a barber. I wanted to ask him, was he a barber? But I didn't really think he was, so I didn't ask. "You must belong to those beef cattle peoples down the road," I said. "They said Asmalikam when they meet you, but they didn't shake hands, always too busy feeding the cattle, fixing the fences, putting up the salt lake shelters, throwing hay. When the white folk poisoned some of the herd, their men stayed up all night with rifles in their hands. I walked 1.5 miles just to see the sight." Hakim Barber said, "I accept some of their doctrines, but farming and raising cattle is not my style." They didn't tell me, and I didn't ask whether Wangaroo had really gone and married him. We sat down to eat, and right away he said he didn't eat collards and pork was unclean. Wangaroo, though, went on through the chitlins and cornbread, the greens and everything else. She talked a blue streak over the sweet potatoes. Everything delighted her. Even the fact that we still used the benches her daddy made for the table when we couldn't afford to buy chairs. "Oh, Mama," then turned to Hakim Barber, "I never knew how lovely these benches are. You can feel the rump prints," she said, running her hands underneath her and along the bench. Then she gave a sigh, and her hand closed over Grandma Dee's butter dish. "That's it," she said. "I knew there was something I wanted to ask you if I could have." She jumped up from the table and went over to the corner where the churn stood, the milk in it clabbered by now. She looked at the churn and looked at it. "This churn top is what I need. Didn't Uncle Buddy whittle it out of a tree you all used to have?" "Yes," I said. She said happily. "And I want the dasher too." "Uncle Buddy whittled that too?" asked the barber. Dee Wangaroo looked up at me. "Aunt Dee's first husband whittled the dash," said Maggie so low you couldn't almost hear it. "His name was Henry, but they called him Stash." "Maggie's brain is like an elephant's," Wangaroo said, laughing. "I can use the churn top as a centerpiece for the alcove table," she said, sliding a plate over the churn. "And I'll think of something artistic to do with the dasher." When she finally finished wrapping the dasher and the handle stuck out, I took it for a moment in my hands. You didn't even have to look close to see where all the hands pushing the dasher up and down to make butter had left a kind of sink in the wood. In fact, there were a lot of small sinks. You could see where thumbs and fingers had sunk into the wood. It was beautiful light yellow wood from a tree that grew in the yard where Big Dee and Stash had lived. After dinner, Dee Wangaroo went to the trunk at the foot of my bed and started rifling through it. Maggie hung back in the kitchen over the dishpan. Out came Wangaroo with 2 quilts. They had been pieced by Grandma Dee, and then Big Dee and me had hung them on the quilt frames on the front porch, and quilted them. One was in the Lone Star pattern. The other was Walk Around the Mountain. And both of them were scraps of dresses Grandma Dee had worn 50 and more years ago. Bits and pieces of Grandma Jarrell's paisley shirts, and one teeny faded blue piece, about the size of a penny matchbox. That was from Great-Grandpa Ezra's uniform, which he wore in the Civil War. "Mama," Wangaroo said, sweet as a bird, "can I have these old quilts?" I heard something fall in the kitchen, and a minute later the kitchen door slammed. "Why don't you take one or 2 of the others?" I asked. "These old things was just done by me and Big Dee from some tops for Grandma pieced before she died." "No, I don't want those. They're stitched around the borders by machine." "That'll make them better," I said. "That's not the point. These are all old pieces of dresses Grandma used to wear. She did all this stitching by hand. Imagine." She held the quilts securely in her arms, stroking them. "Some of the pieces, like the lavender ones, came from old clothes her mother handed down to her," I said, moving up to touch the quilts. Dee Wangaroo moved back just enough so I couldn't reach the quilts. They already belonged to her. "Imagine," she breathed, again clutching them to her bosom. "The truth is," I said, "I already promised to give them quilts to Maggie for when she marries John Thomas." She gasped like a bee had stung her. "Maggie can't appreciate these quilts," she said. "She'd probably be backward enough to put them to everyday use." "I reckon she would," I said. God knows I've been saving them up for long enough with nobody using them. I hope she will. I didn't want to bring up how I'd offered Dee Wangaroo a quilt when she went away to college. And then she told me they were old-fashioned and out of style. But they're priceless, she was saying now, furiously, for she had a temper. Maggie would put them on a bed, and in 5 years they'd be rags, less than that. She can always make some more, I said. Maggie knows how to quilt. Dee Wangaroo looked at me with hatred. You will just not understand. The point is, these quilts. Well, what would you do with them? I said, stumped. Hang them, she said, as if that was the only thing you could do with quilts. Maggie by now was standing in the door. I could hear the sound her feet made as they scraped all over each other. She could have them, Mama, she said, like somebody used to never winning anything or having anything reserved for her. I can remember Grandma Dee without the quilts. I looked at her hard. She had filled her bottom lip with checkerberry snuff and gave her face kind of a dopey hangdog look. It was Grandma Dee and Big Dee who taught her how to quilt herself. She stood there with her scarred hands hidden in the folds of her skirt. Then she looked at her sister with something like fear, but she wasn't mad at her. This was Maggie's portion. This was the way she knew God to work. When I looked at her, that something hit me in the top of my head, ran down to the soles of my feet. Just like when I'm in church and the Spirit of God touches me and I get happy and I shout. I did something I'd never done before. Hugged Maggie to me, then dragged her on into the room, snatched the quilts out of Miss Wangaroo's hand, and dumped them into Maggie's lap. Maggie just sat there on my bed with her mouth open. Take one or two of the others, I said to Dee, but she turned without a word and went to a Kim Barber. You just don't understand, she said as Maggie and I came out to the car. What don't I understand, I wanted to know. Your heritage, she said. And then she turned to Maggie, kissed her, and said, You ought to try to make something of yourself, too, Maggie. It's really a new day for us, but from the way you and Mama still live, you'd never know it. She put on some sunglasses that hid everything above the tip of her nose and chin. Maggie smiled, maybe at the sunglasses, but a real smile, not scared. After we watched the car dust settle, I asked Maggie to bring me a dip of snuff. And then the two of us sat there, just enjoying until it was time to go to the house and go to bed. All right, so that was Alice Walker's Everyday Use. Now, Everyday Use is one of the most popular and widely studied short stories by Alice Walker. It was first published in Harper's Magazine in 1973 before being collected in Walker's short story collection In Love and Trouble. Walker uses everyday use to explore the different attitudes towards Black American culture and heritage. The story is narrated in the first person by Miss Johnson, a large African woman who has two daughters, Dee, the older of the two, who is visiting, and Maggie, the younger one. Whereas Maggie is kind of weak and lacking in confidence and shares many of her mother's views, Dee is rather different, or some might even say completely different. Miss Johnson tells us how she and the local church put together the funds to send Dee away to school and get an education. When Dee returned, she would read stories to her mother and sister. And Miss Johnson tells us that she had never had much of an education as her school was shut down. And although Maggie can read, her eyesight is poor, and according to her mother, is not especially clever. She also tells us about how their previous house recently burned down, a house that Dee never really liked. Dee hasn't visited her mother and sister in the new house, but she has said that when she does come, she will not bring her friends with her, implying she is ashamed where her family lives. However, Miss Johnson then describes Dee's first visit to the new house. She turns up with her new partner, a short and stocky Muslim man, who Miss Johnson refers to as Assalamualaikum, after the Muslim greeting as the man speaks when he arrives, a corruption of Salam Alaikum. Dee then tells her mother that she is no longer known as Dee, but first to be called Wangaroo Lewanika Kimanjo, because she no longer wishes to bear a name that derived from the white people who oppressed her and other African Americans. But then her mom does point out that Dee was named after her aunt, Dee, but Dee is convinced that the name originally came from their white oppressors. She starts to imagine the objects in the house which belonged to her grandmother, saying which ones she intends to take for herself. One of the main points of the story, or almost I would maybe even say the climax, is when she looks over the quilts that her grandmother had hand knitted and hand quilted or hand sewed, And she's immediately like, I need all of these. But the mom's like, or Miss Johnson says, oh, I'm going to keep a few for Maggie when she marries John Thomas. And Dee responds by insulting her sister and saying that she's so backward she'd probably put the special quilts to everyday use, thus wearing them out to rags in a few years. Although Maggie is just kind of like resignedly saying, okay, fine, you can have them, Miss Johnson is suddenly inspired to snatch them back from her and hold Maggie close to herself, refusing to give them up to Dee and telling her to take one of the other quilts instead. Dee leaves then, telling her mother and Maggie that they don't understand their own heritage. She also tells Maggie to try and make something of herself rather than remaining home with their mother. After they left, Maggie and her mother just sit outside until it's time to go indoors and retire to bed in a very country-ish, just relaxing way. Now the central crux of this story is the difference between Dee and her mother and their perspectives and attitudes. Whereas Miss Johnson sees everything in the terms of the immediate family and home, as she is the mother of the family and really the only caretaker, Dee is more interested in escaping this immediate environment. She does this first by just leaving the family home and then becoming romantically involved with a man of African Muslim descent. She also looks deeper into her African roots to understand where she came from, as the phrase has it, not just in terms of the family's direct lineage of daughter, mother, grandmother, and so on, which is Miss Johnson's way of looking at it, as exemplified by their discussion over the origins of Dee's name, but in a wider and deeper sense of African American history and belonging. This departure from her mother's set of values is most neatly embodied by her change of name, rejecting the family name Dee in favor of the African name Wangaru Lee Wanika Kamanjo. Names, in fact, are very important in this story. Maggie is obviously known by a European name, and Johnson, the family name borne by Mama, and thus by her daughters, doubly enforces John and son, the stamp of male European power on their lives and history. Dee, too, is very much a family name, not just because it is the name the family uses for their elder daughter, but because it is the name borne by numerous female members of the family, going back for generations. But Dee suspects it's ultimately originally of European extraction and wants to distance herself from this. Dee's rejection of the immediate family's small and somewhat patriarchal attitude is also embodied by the fact that she has reportedly hated their old house, which had recently burnt down. This short story kind of incorporates how Dee's search for her ancestral identity through African culture and language is something which was kind of more popular among African Americans in the wake of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. If you remember, Everyday Use was published in 1973. Indeed, a productive dialogue could have been put, I really wish there was, between Dee's outlook in everyday use and the arguments put forward by prominent Black American writers and activists of the 1970s, such as Audre Lorde, who often wrote in her poem A Woman Speaks, for example, about the ancestral African power that Black American women at least carry, and a link to their deeper roots, which should be acknowledged and cultivated. But what I really found interesting about Walker's kind of the way she wrote Everyday Use was how she prevented the story from becoming wholly celebratory of Dee's newfound sense of self. First, she has Miss Johnson narrate the story, so we only see Dee from her mother's very different perspective. We only view Dee, or Wangaru as she might like, from the outside, as it were. Second, Dee does not conduct herself in ways which are altogether commendable. She just snatches the best quilts, and she's kind of determined to wrest them from her mother and sister, and she completely disregards Maggie's strong filial links to her aunt and grandmother, who actually taught her how to quilt, whereas it's assumed that Dee was just either too busy or she didn't really care. This quilt is like a symbol for Maggie's link with the previous matriarchs of the family, which Dee is kind of attempting to sever her from. But she's not really doing this out of kindness for Maggie, despite her speech to her younger sister at the end. Instead, she seems to be motivated by more selfish reasons and asserts her naturally dominant personality and ability to control her sister in order to get her way. The very title of the story, Everyday Use, can be analyzed as a sign of Dee's dismissive and patronizing attitude towards her sister and mother. To her, they don't even know how to use a good quilt properly, and her sister would just put it out for everyday use. Before we continue, I do want to give you guys a little bit of my own opinions, and maybe you guys could talk about this in the comments as well. But honestly, I kind of hated Dee throughout this entire story. For me, I often felt like, for example, when she was changing her name to Wangaroo, I was like, okay, but you're not really trying to look into the name you were given. And while I completely support her changing her name, I don't understand the reason she really did it. And to me, it just sounds like it was just a wrong decision. Now, obviously, you have to understand that she was really just trying to find her sense of self. But in the end, it was almost as if she was creating a whole other ancestry for herself rather than paying attention to the one she has, which Miss Johnson is very passionate about. When she's trying to take the quilt away from Maggie, that just really made me mad, because I was like, okay, it doesn't seem like you care too much about your mother or your sister, who are kind of poor, they're not doing super well, and you seem to be kind of wrapped up in yourself. And while it's obviously she has the right to do that, and she can completely do that, normally, especially, you can obviously, Miss Johnson might think so as well, that Dee should have maybe taken a little bit better care of her family. But at this point, you can kind of tell that Miss Johnson doesn't really care about Dee. I mean, she does care about her, but she doesn't too much care, or she doesn't take too much offense from her or from what she does. And her and Maggie at the very end, when they're just sitting out watching the sun go down, you can kind of see they're just yeah, that's Dee, and they've kind of just resigned themselves to it. This is such a powerful short story, and it is incredibly famous. You've probably either heard of it, maybe even read it. You probably know someone who's read it. It's pretty famous. And every time I read this, I swear to God, I always get kind of ticked off by Dee and what she says, especially when it gets to the quilt part. And it always makes me so happy when her mom's like, okay, I'm going to take these and give these to Maggie, and you can have these ones. Because I'm just because that is, like I said before, the one link Maggie has to the old matriarchs of the family. Another thing I want to talk about before we end off is just how prominent mothers and women are in this story. Like I said before, Walker is known for being a feminist. She calls herself a womanist. And it's just so interesting for me to see how even Miss Johnson, the mother, says that she was often more interested in the man's job. So obviously, while she still is in that patriarchal mindset, that is what she's grown up in. And at the same time, though, she's incredibly strong in doing everything that a normal couple probably would have done during that time. And it is very inspiring. Now, that was all for today. I hope you enjoyed the story. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you'd like to read next.